Kaiser Permanente is one of the largest nonprofit healthcare plans in the United States. At AfroTech 2019, then Kaiser Permanente Chairman and Chief Executive Officer Bernard Tyson, may he rest in peace, talked with Blavity CEO Morgan DeBond about the healthcare Goliath's efforts in the social determinants of health and how technology can play a role in amplifying their impact.
We are unique in that we're as I said, we're such a big mega health system. We take care of almost 13 million people, and we exist in communities in which 68 million people live. So we get a great view of the inequities in this country. So you have one community where it has everything that one can imagine to thrive, right? So you have great police service, grocery stores everywhere.
Right.
A gas station is truly a gas station. And you feel safe to walk in the evenings and at night and all that stuff. You go to another neighborhood and you almost can't get the street lights changed.
Right.
And there's no grocery store, and crime is high. And in a lot of cases, those communities did not have a voice at the table when money was being divided up governmentally to fund all these programs. So Kaiser Permanente is playing a heavy advocacy role to make sure that we build what we call healthy communities for all of our communities, because we know that healthcare can only do so much to help you with your health.
Right.
And so if you are living on fried chicken every day, and,
Popeyes.
Popeyes. But in these communities, it's how do we really provide options for people to make choices.
That's right.
And so that's really what Thrive Local is about, that we're working with our resources, community resources, and we're helping people to thrive. We just announced that we're going to do drones with UPS.
Okay.
Right?
Tell us more.
And somebody asked me, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. But,
The drones.
but we're going to have the drones doing something.
Right. Just dropping off food.
Yeah, but the whole point is, with all this technology,
Yeah.
you can rethink how you want your business to work.
Right.
Right? And that's been the beauty of the technology now. It has allowed us to disrupt our organization. And that's what's happening in organization. You basically, in the 19th and the 20th century, built organizations to conform and comply, right? And part of the third industrial revolution was mass production. And we're now in the fourth industrial revolution. We now have the kind of technology where you can disaggregate everything. And so, we used to have all of our patients coming in. Now, over 50% of our interactions with patients are on the iPhone and the iPads and technology. It's a whole different mindset that you can establish, and operating procedures on the platform of technology. And so I would encourage people to keep innovating in this area.
I'm Will Lucas, and this is Black Tech, Green Money. I'm going to introduce you to some of the biggest names, some of the brightest minds, and brilliant ideas. If you're black in building or simply using tech to secure your bag, this podcast is for you. Sevetri Wilson is a serial entrepreneur and founder at Reslia, a New Orleans-based tech startup that helps nonprofit organizations increase capacity and enable enterprises that deploy billions of dollars to scale their impact. She was honored with the Nobel Prize for Public Service, the Jefferson Award, and was featured in the Senate report to the White House on volunteerism during the Obama administration. Just before we recorded this episode, she announced Reslia had just raised an $8 million Series A. There's undeniably a market need for good nonprofits doing great work. I asked Sevetri about what she commonly sees hinders the realization of their full potential.
So, interesting enough, probably around May 20th, there was a report released just talking about philanthropy. And really talking about the disparity in philanthropy and where money goes and how that money is just dispersed, right? And so for certain nonprofits, we're talking about like nonprofits run by Black and brown people, there's a disparity in like them being able to access resources to grow their nonprofit organizations. And particularly as we are in the age, even in the day where we're heavily focused on equity and equality and how we can fix the things that have just historically been wrong related to ensuring that people of color, particularly Black people, right? Because we're not going to like blanket all of us over people of color any longer. And one of the things that the study was essentially saying, and this is by Eco Green and Brisbane, is that a lot of times nonprofit organizations, one, they don't have access to the Rolodex of organizations that can give them the resources. Once they get to the table, if they ever get to the table, then they don't have the right tools, resources, or are able to essentially display the information the way funders want it, right? And so they're at a disadvantage that way. And what it takes to do that type of data, type of analytics, to pull those type of reports takes a lot of time and money, which they don't have because they're on the ground working every day in and out of their nonprofit organizations. And so when we think about how nonprofits are just like less resourced, like that's one of the biggest hindrances that's holding organizations back from growing. And then also, how do you move beyond just being a nonprofit leader, but thinking of yourself as like a business leader? Like this organization is incorporated. You should be thinking about it like a business. You should operate like a business. How do you move from just taking on funding? How do you begin to diversify into services? And so these are definitely, I could go on and on, but I'll kind of wrap it up there. We could definitely continue to talk about what are like the blocks for nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, I think about, I live in a place where we're at my city, we have more nonprofits per capita than anywhere else in the country, right? Which tells me we're stepping on all of our toes.
Yes.
Right? And do you think we consider collaboration at the level we should? Because I mean, you get it. With territorial, the pies aren't as big for people to be able to fund these efforts and et cetera. Like, how do you think? So we cannibalize each other. How do you think about when you see nonprofits that just pop up because somebody's passionate about something? How do you process that?
Yes. Even with inside of our software, we're always trying to benchmark for does this organization need to exist? Right. And even as a consultant, like many moons ago, working with nonprofit organizations, and people used to come to me like, oh, I want to start this organization. First, I always ask, like, does this organization like this exist in your community already?
Yeah.
And usually they're like, yeah, but have you volunteered for them yet? Have you spoke to the organizational leader yet? Have you spoke to the have you had a conversation?
Yeah.
With them yet to understand like what are your challenges, and if I don't feel like you're effective in my community, do you have the bandwidth, and you should, because you're about to start a new nonprofit, to help them get to where they're trying to go without being the founder or CEO of it, right? And so I'm a big believer of trying to bring organizations together, and even have seen situations where large funders would look at organizations that they were funding and they're like, you were basically doing the same work. If you guys actually came together, meaning like formed, right, together, we would give you more money and we think you could be more effective. But of course, what comes in the way with that, right? Yeah. So a little bit of like pride and ego, who's going to run the organization? What role do I, get? Are my issues going to be heard? And so there are a lot of barriers to that. But, we know, because we've been crunching numbers forever, not just in your community, but we've seen a 4x increase of nonprofit organizations over the past 10 years, not only in the country, but across the world. And so we know there's a lot of reasons for this, not just like the do-gooders in our community that want to create nonprofit organizations, but there are a lot of, as we consider, like legacy foundations being created, And so with that there's more organizations being created. There's also more philanthropic dollars being deployed than we've ever seen before. And so that could also be a reason, right, that these organizations are forming to actually go after some of these new funds that are coming out, which is the case with COVID-19, and is also the case now with saving Black lives, right?
That's right. So how do you inspire or help people who are passionate about a thing get the business side under them? Because I think about too often when we think about impact and being passionate about a particular issue, whether it be social justice, whether it be COVID, the product or the offering may be lacking. You know, we have so much heart, but so little business sophistication in too many instances. Not every instance, but in too many instances. So talk a little bit about when those folks who you ask, you know, does this already exist in your community or have you volunteered there? How do you, you know, advise them to not only, you know, pump the brakes a little bit, but get that work done in the right way?
Yeah, the same things that set back, hold back, keep down nonprofits are the same things that hold back, set back, keep down us from building businesses as well, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that many of those things, I've obviously worked with a lot of small business owners to help them get their business off the ground. I've worked with a lot of nonprofits to get them to get their organizations off the ground. And I tell you, there's so many parallels that run between the two. But yeah, and it really is. It's so very similar. And so for nonprofits, it's always about what are you going to focus on, right? So what can you get really good at where people are like, oh, we go to them for this. And I think that just our nature, we want to help everybody and be everything to everybody. And we can't be that way if we want to get things done. And if we want to grow our organizations, we have to figure out like, what is that thing that we might care about a lot of things. We got to really hone in on that one thing that's going to allow us to be able to not only gain the expertise right around, but to also gather support around so that one thing people are like, oh, I got that person for you. And even when we talk about resources, because generally speaking, when we look at funders, they're trying to put together pieces too, right? And so it's like, what piece are you solving for that's going to make this equation come together? And because you are strapped for resources, you probably don't want to go out there talking about you solve all these other. They're like, well, how? Because you only got a budget of $20,000 a year, so you can't be solving all these things. This don't add up. Like this math don't add up.
Right.
And so, really trying to get organizations to like focus in and like zero in on like what can you solve and be the best at doing, and then how can you begin to look at individuals that support that specific cause. Or create ambassadors and champions of that cause because it's attached to things that other people believe about. And so it's so many parallels, man, to like just being like a founder. Yeah. It is the same, right?
Yeah. So if I can condense what you said into a nutshell, I'm going to ask you this: is what you're saying that I should really just get really, really, really good at one thing or this narrow vertical?
Yeah,
and
like
then
bring it in, right?
And with that, does that cause me to have more success ultimately? Because that's, I think, what people don't see is they see, if I only do this one thing, then how am I going to get bigger?
Yes, and the thing is, it's like if once you do that thing very well, then you can branch out and do other things, right? And you're right about that, but such a good example is like what's happening in Minneapolis right now, right? In Minnesota. And in Minnesota, and just like framing it around the murder of George Floyd, people started giving to the Minnesota fund, right? And so everybody was giving to the Minnesota fund. And when you go to their website, I was kind of like, I gave them to them too. You know, I was like, oh, boom. We got a place we go give to. That's what we go give to.
Yeah.
Then someone sent me a message. It was like, well, you need to give to the Black-led organization. I was like, dang, wait, let me go look at their website. And I looked, I was like, oh no, like none of the people on the website was Black.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm giving money to these people to go help Black people, and they don't even have Black people in their organization. And so I was like, okay, now I gotta look for other organizations. But then I doubled back and I realized that, okay, let me see what they're doing. So they were essentially targeting cash bail and bail bonds. So they were trying to eradicate that. Like that was their mission. So from jump, immediately I knew that the money that we were giving wasn't going to just go back to the protesters, you know, who were out there, although some of it would. But they raised so much money that now they're going to essentially be able to eradicate cash bail in their city. That's crazy to me, right? So the entire city, they're going to be eradicated. However, they raised so much money that they said that start giving to these other organizations. This specific organization is looking to defund the police. This specific organization is working on the ground specifically helping with housing. This specific, you know, see, these are organizations where I'm like, okay, yes, we want to get protesters out of jail. Boom. We need to defund the police. Boom. You know, and so it just becomes very clear because of their mission.
So whose responsibility is it then? Because, you know, I think about when these social uprisings occur, you'll see this proliferation of messages on social media on who you should be giving to, right? And so to your point, like whose responsibility is it to make sure that that is clearly defined for the end user who just wants to give $50 or $100 or $1,000 to an organization? Because can we expect the consumer or the donator or that benevolent person to go do all that research that Sevetri will do?
Well, I do think that we do got to do a little bit better on ourselves for sure. And then also, I think that, you know, someone inside the community, right? And so that's how I found about all the other funds, is because someone from that community said, oh, here are some other funds that are like Black led. I do think that there's opportunity to vet organizations, and maybe that's somebody, you know, who's listening. They're like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually create a platform that does it. And so that's why I was like, dang, I should have like did more. I should have went to the website. I should have looked at the people that was associated with it. If you want to take it a little bit further, then you can go to like Candace's website and do a search of them. But the only problem when you start really doing that is that you begin to exclude Black organizations who, again, going back to maybe they don't have the data points, maybe they don't have the information into these platforms. It doesn't mean that they're not doing the work and they can't get the work done. And so you have to be like really careful and mindful of trying to like vet organizations as well. But I do feel that, you know, you can go look in the community. You come to New Orleans and we'll let you know who to give to or who, you know, who are really doing what they're supposed to do with the money.
Yeah. So I think about, you know, you're solving a lot of issues for, I would, for in layman's terms, like a lot of back office issues for nonprofits. Is that an adequate statement?
Yeah, for nonprofits and for, as we consider, our enterprise customers. So we work with Oxfam America, we work with United Way. And so we essentially we consider like the one app connector between the nonprofit or grantee, because it doesn't have to be a nonprofit. It can also be a vendor, which can be a for-profit, to the grantor or that entity that's deploying capital. So if you're a city, a private foundation, a corporation, we work with them all. And so we essentially manage that process of how they give money to organizations or vendors who essentially do the work, right? Because these foundations, they're not actually doing them real, you know, they're not on the ground doing the work. They're funding organizations and vendors to do the work. And so our platform essentially is that connective tissue between both, where not only we're monitoring the information that's coming in, the data around it, we're doing the reporting, the evaluations, and then we're also on the nonprofit side providing them with capacity building tools and technical assistance so that they can be better stewards of not only their money, but also better stewards of how they run their organizations, as well as how they train their team members. We essentially have drastically reduced what we were doing as consultants and productized it, right? And so we took everything that we were doing as consultants, for these large grantors and these grantees and these nonprofits, and we began to productize it into software and deliver it through a subscription-based platform. That's what we do.
Yeah. So I'm super interested in your take on this then, because I think about the importance of wealth in our community, and I find with my, in context to you, my uneducated, right, perspective on this, like, is at some point we have to move past waiting for someone to write us a check for our good work, because they may feel like, oh, again, to your point, like, who's doing good work? Let me give them some money. And you have the person who's trying to do the good work always with their hand out, always with their hat in their hand, like, trying to raise money somewhere. And how can we think about other ways to support and put fuel in the could for our good work? Or could it be value exchanged?
Yes, for sure. I think that there is value exchange for particularly like nonprofits. Most people think that most nonprofits, their money comes from like private foundations and corporations and these other philanthropic resources, but that's not the case. The majority of most nonprofits, their money is coming from contracts, services, or from individuals. And so I think that that's like a myth buster, right? Because most people think like philanthropy is controlling, which to a certain extent they are, because they can also entirely fund a nonprofit, right, to do their work, to do the work that they want them to do. But most nonprofits in the U.S. at least actually don't sustain themselves off philanthropic dollars. And so that's very important to like note. But like one of the things, even with our software, what we want to do is, since we own both relationships, the grantor and the grantee, more organizations that come into our platform, we want to essentially begin recommending them to the grantors, because we know their giving history, we know the type of organizations they like to give to, the causes, et cetera. And we could essentially take organizations that would never get opportunity to get in front of them and essentially scout on their behalf, right? By just knowing their data. And so by doing that, we're able to remove the biases that have prevented these organizations from getting in front of these other dollars for a very long time. And that's not just philanthropy, but that's government, right? Because our customers are also government, corporations, and so on. And so when we think about that, it's about like diversifying. And so like one of my customers, like Metromorphosis, when we first came in contact with them, they were doing maybe like $250,000 a year in annual budget. They had like one full-time person, a contracted person. And today they have like a full suite of team. Fast forward, they're doing a budget about 1.8 million. And what allowed them to get there is that they started going after city contracts, right? And so they went after the DBE, which is essentially a set aside that says like 30% of this opportunity of this large $1 billion project has to go to minority businesses. And they went after that contract. And so they essentially are overseeing that deployment and where that money goes. And so now they're like, okay, now they're going after more government contracts, and they're a nonprofit and they're going after government contracts in the same way a business would be going after those contracts. And they got more power because they got the community. And so somebody like, oh, who do we pick? We're going to pick the person with all the resources. And so nonprofits could win like that when they start thinking like that.
Recent uprisings regarding racial injustice prompted several major corporations to step up to the plate with bags of money to fight racism, open up doors of opportunity, and reinforce their pipelines with diverse talent. Some of this we've seen before. Skeptics would say it's not enough and to look at their corporate history, look at their board of directors, look at their vendor diversity. So, were previous efforts insincere, or did they simply not know what to do to solve these problems? Sevetri speaks on it.
Yes. So I do think that we are coming into a different age of corporate giving, where people are beginning to hire people that are a little bit more in tune, right, to trying to make an impact. In addition to that, I do feel that we know people being you just not sincere about stuff. We were like, all right, here they go. I've been very critical of like Gucci, right? Gucci, they been to black people, and then they was like, boom, so $10 million. Like the owners of Gucci, like they behind, which they blow $10 million in the summer, and it's just like that's an insult to my intelligence. Like that's just an insult to my intelligence right there. But
yeah,
there are other institutions like you will say like a JP Morgan Chase, right, where they have essentially deployed billions at this point. And people will say JP Morgan Chase, like, oh, we don't like this type of corporate philanthropy because they're essentially disrupting, which some people would say, and they're rebuilding and redesigning, say, Black cities like Detroit. And so what do we feel about that, right? Are we paying attention? Like, are we really paying attention to what's going on and who's involved? Now, I will say on JP Morgan, if you look at their team in Detroit, it's a lot of Black people there, but also holding Black people accountable for doing things for Black people, right? And being sincere about that is important. But you do see corporations now who are really putting a huge stake into not just like, oh, we're going to give here, we're going to give these organizations, but they're trying to actually transform entire, we consider like sectors, communities, cities. And so we also have to be very mindful of what that means.
Got it. And so not just for nonprofits, but you have a proficiency in helping people figure out how to charge for their stuff, their value, right? And so I would imagine that most entrepreneurs will look at the landscape of the market and say, okay, what is the closest person to what I'm doing charging? And let me base my price upon that. Like, is that in your mind the best way to go about this?
So I think that is like the easiest way to go about it. But it might not be what's best for your work, right? And so I do think that we have a problem with like pricing in general, in a way that it actually takes us under, right? And so I think that when we think about pricing, it's from an organizational standpoint, it's like, can you also, make a living? Can you get the work done? Can you hire people effectively? When you scope out your entire budget, is it actually related to your demographics, who you're serving, the additional need that may exist around them, right? And so I think you have to take into consideration all the complexities that may impact your price that may not impact the person across from you's price.
So when you say, I'm going to charge X, and it's probably more money than a lot of people may be comfortable charging for something, how do you get over the internal, like, oh, how do I put this number in front of folks?
Well, me today or me 10 years ago?
Today, you probably like, look, this is the number, fam. This is the number.
Because, your numbers change with experience too, right? And so that's something to think about. Like, your numbers change with your experience. And 10 years ago, my experience was a lot different than it is now, and what I have to bring to the table, but the resources that I bring, the partners that I bring, the network that I bring. And so you're bringing to the table more than just what you can do pen to paper, right? And so you take into account all of those things when you're setting your price. And I know I do, at least. So I think that those are things that people have to consider.
Do you, to that point, is it that people are just paying for the service that you're offering, or they're paying for the value of being able to work with you and the service?
For Reslia, they're paying for the service, right? So because we're a SaaS business model, what you pay and what the next person pays is not going to change, right? So we have like set numbers. If you're on the enterprise platform, you're paying per seat. If you are a nonprofit organization, you're paying specifically for your subscription. So those numbers are unchanged. Now in Solid Ground, so my other business, that is based on, what I'm setting my fees and anything related to my expenses for. And I'll tell you, like, now when I'm asked to be a part of projects, it's kind of, when you start planting seeds, those seeds are going to start to grow. And it may not come to fruition immediately, but over time it will. And so today I literally get asked to be a part of projects and on like pulled into like RFPs, responses for work that I never even have to touch. They just need to use my name and my resume and my background, and they just want me on the team.
Yeah.
And literally, I do some consulting and I get a check. Like I don't have to do anything. But that's what 10 plus years of work now affords me to be a part of teams who are going after multi-million-dollar contracts, and they're like, we need to feature on our team. And so, how much you gonna charge us to be on our, well, boom, that's what I'm gonna charge. And when y'all start doing the work, they call me like, all right, what do you think about this and this? Because then, I have to actually do some work as a part of the contract. But for the most part, I don't have to chase business on my solid ground with my consulting company. The business comes to me back now. Like it comes to me now. And so like, that's like, we think about like building stuff for ourselves, as you mentioned earlier, so we don't have to go ask these people for money. Then we become the philanthropists, right? And so then we can direct money to organizations that look like us, and they don't have to go chase money from these organizations that don't look like them. And so like, when we're talking about like the ultimate goals, like that's what we're building for.
Oh, we're gonna come back. We're gonna come back to that. Matter of fact, we might close on that topic. But there's a couple of things I want to make sure I pull out of here, and it's, you talked about, over 10 years you've built up a reputation and a name and integrity and all these things that say, look, if we're trying to do X, Y, and Z, we need Sevetri on the team, right? And so you've got so many people in our audience who are, building, for lack of a better phrase, boutique services, consulting services, personal services, and et cetera. And how is it that you saw the long game in that? Because I would imagine that you knew one day it would pay off, but you might, and I don't know, but you perhaps didn't know that, one day it will be, people just call me and I'll set my price. And I step in for a meeting and I bounce. You may have known. I'm assuming. I'm making assumptions, which I shouldn't do.
I don't know if I knew that. I think that when it started to happen to me, I think that it became very obvious why, right? And so when I think about, and I have like mentors, et cetera, my mentors got contracts with Chevron and this person, and they get $25,000 monthly retainers, and people might call them for an hour a month.
Yeah.
Like, there's levels to this, right? There's levels. There's levels. I ain't at that level yet.
All right.
But there are levels to this. And so when you hear stuff like that, and people are kind of like trying to show you like how this works, right? And how your ability, people think that social media influencing is something. No. Being able for public affairs from an oil company to call you once a month and you get $25,000 per hour, that's influence. Like, people don't understand, like, it's levels, man. It's levels. And so when I think about like influence, that's like the sphere of influence. I think about like things that can like drive elections, people that can drive people to the polls, people that can help influence someone getting into a position. Like those are type of influences that I think about. And when you begin to have those type of influences in your community and in your sphere or your business circles, people begin to reach out to you because that makes you make them more competitive, right? And so for me, starting out, I was just, I was so young when I started my first business that I was just like so green. So at 22, I was just out here, first, very small contracts, doing consulting, like marketing, public relations, digital advertising, stuff like that. From there, we started getting contracts, starting off with like nonprofit organizations, doing work for them, then law firms, building their websites, stuff like that. And then those contracts started to like increase. Then I went to a conference, and at that entrepreneurs conference, they basically were talking about government contracting. And then I was like, government contract, this is interesting. And then this woman, Nicole, she was talking about how she was living in her mother's basement. She was a single mother, and she got into government contracting. and she was going as a junior partner. So she was basically subcontracting, right? And so that's another hack for any entrepreneurs out there who are trying to get started. Sometimes our eyes be on the big prize. We be like, oh, we're about to go after this large contract. What you really need to be going after is the company that's going to get the contract,
Yeah.
and then get
The
work
prime.
subcontracting.
Yeah, the prime contractor.
Yes, because that's just the things that we just don't know yet,
That's
right? And
That's
so
right.
we'll be going after a large contract with no capabilities, not enough proof, like none of this, and it's just because we're not there yet. Unless we know somebody that's going to write us a check, which is very seldom. And so going and subcontracting and learning the game from these larger companies is something that I got hip to pretty earlier. And same thing with Nicole in government contracting. Once she got hip to that, then it allowed her to like go after these larger contracts as the prime and then subcontract other consultants and agencies underneath. And so that's essentially how I started building my company as a whole. But then when I started Reslia, I had to like pull back from SGI, and I was like, okay, we're gonna like maintain these contracts over here. But from that, just sitting a little bit, letting marinate, other stuff started happening. Then people started just coming to me. And so I think that that's something that, just stay out here and start working. Like, get out here and work, y'all, and like just make it happen, because at the end of the day, the door's going to start to open. You just have to understand what's the code, right? You have to figure out the code. And once you figure out the code, it's going to unlock the door. Then you got to unlock another door. Then you unlock another door.
Yeah.
That's just like kind of the process.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, like, you're building in a community that is not historically known for technology, right? You're not in the biggest ecosystem in the world. And you just raised, you announced $8 million Series A, Series A recently. And talk to me a little bit about, because I think sometimes we take for granted that the large portions of people trying to build tech companies are not in Silicon Valley, right? But they're in Oklahoma, and they're in New Orleans, and they're in Ohio, and they're in, these other communities. And you've got people with different lifestyles trying to do this thing. And we don't always speak to them, but we speak the language of a Silicon Valley. And so talk to me about the challenges you've had to overcome with building in a community that is not a traditional tech hub.
Yes. So building in the industry, right? It's interesting because when I first started building the company, Reslia, nobody believed me. Nobody believed that we could build a company in this space. And it honestly hasn't been, you have like the black bots out there. You have like these grant management systems, which we're quite a bit different than grant management systems, who have been dominating the space for like 20 plus years. So this old school technology they're using. And so when we started coming into the space, people were like, oh, well, how big is this space? Is it too niche, et cetera? So the same thing they were telling the companies like Carta and everybody else who now worth billions of dollars. And to me, it was actually Salesforce that began, in my opinion, to open up like just the VC world around like selling to philanthropy, because they began to aggressively start acquiring companies in our space. And like over the past year and a half, they probably acquired almost like 1.5 billion companies in our space to build out a suite of products for nonprofit organizations. And so if you follow Salesforce, they had like the 1% pledge and all these other things going on that they've kind of pushed in Silicon Valley. And so when we came into the space earlier than that, before that started happening, no one really felt it. But now we get so much outreach from investors like, oh, yes, we've been following the nonprofit world technology, and we feel like there's so much room for improvement and technology advancements in the space. But that wasn't the case a couple years ago. And so now we don't really have to prove that part of it anymore. But had I not had the opportunity to keep going, we probably wouldn't exist anymore, right? And for us, we began to really evaluate how we can expand, right? How can we expand beyond nonprofits? And that gave birth to like our enterprise platform, which targets obviously 3 core verticals. But it was definitely like really challenging. And then in New Orleans, the tech space is definitely, we've had like a few success stories here and there, but generally ain't nobody coming scouting in New Orleans, like that's just what it is. And for me, at one point I was like, oh man, do I have to move to San Francisco? Do I have to move to Silicon Valley? And was actually legitimately like thinking about it. And I just realized how much that would have like completely drastically changed my entire journey. Like my whole journey would look different had I done that. And so I am happy that I stayed in the South and began to like find people who were investing in founders outside of Silicon Valley, which now I believe, like particularly for like SaaS companies, people are doing like more of that than they were several years ago.
So one of the things that these uprisings, these social justice uprisings, and not only the George Floyds, but the Amy Coopers and the Ahmaud Arbery's, or Amy Cooper's, who was on the other side of this conversation.
Yeah,
but
I know.
yeah, you know what I'm saying. And so these situations brought me to is, when I think about being a founder and being in the technology industry and trying to generate wealth, right? We're not just doing this to do stuff, but we're trying to build wealth for our communities and for our families. And it started to make me think more about what is like, okay, we want to build wealth, take care of our people, but like, how are we activating that? So, and what I mean by that is we can't just be silent anymore, in my opinion. I believe, and I'm wondering your take on this, is because we see so many people who will be in it for the bag, but won't speak up, or maybe they're afraid to speak or don't know how to speak up. And maybe I don't want to be unfair because not everybody's public about how they do things and how they move. But I do feel like there is a new day upon us where we have to be vocal about these issues. And I'm wondering how you think about things. Has your feelings changed about how we behave as Black entrepreneurs who are building wealth and who are impacting our communities in a certain way? Because I've really been thinking about that, and how, like, what is the purpose of wealth?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So, I mean, let's like unpack that a little bit, right? And so when we think about, I think about, first of all, this is a conversation I was having recently about some of the issues that I had with like Black investors, right? When I was first going out to raise money, how difficult it was to raise money from Black investors, like kind of coming up. And what I began to realize is that because we are so new to wealth, we're so new to money, that we're so risk averse. And so I started thinking about that, right? As far as like investors, where they put their money, Black investors, they like real estate and, things that they have historically taught to like. And so a lot of them are new to technology and invest in technology, and the idea that, oh man, like I could lose my money, like done. And like a lot of them have a hard time wrapping their mind around that. And just now kind of being pulled into it, whether they're in like the private equity space. And so when we think about like how we challenge from that perspective to helping our businesses around us to get the resources they need internally so that they can build their companies, I think like that's one challenge. But as we create more millionaires, and I think generally like our generation, as we accumulate more, we'll do more by way of the generation that we were born in and how we kind of came through society. And so I think that that's something to think about, like generationally, what does wealth look like? How it's passed down, how it's held onto, and then what is the thought process around that? Is it something that, oh, I'm holding wealth to pass it down to my kids versus, oh, I have wealth, so now I can ensure I made this wealth via my company, and I want to ensure that 10 other individuals become millionaires through ensuring their companies are successful, right? And so it also becomes like, what becomes our legacy that we internally hold around wealth in our communities? And then how do we begin to build upon that legacy? And it doesn't necessarily have to be by me exchanging money. It can be by another form. One thing I say about cities, right? Black people have opportunity in contracting inside of cities because a lot of times, particularly in these large urban cities, Black people have the power of the pen. Black people are mayors in cities, and we have to hold them accountable to ensuring that Black businesses get these contracts, because that creates wealth as well. And so there's so many ways we can build wealth in our communities by holding each other accountable and creating a playbook. And if these people don't care, they don't want us to do that. You didn't vote me in here, to be honest. And so it's like, why are you nervous? That person didn't vote you in.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's so many ways we come at wealth that we just have to create this collective, plan to do it. And we got to put the right people in the right positions to make it happen. And we can no longer, as you say, stay quiet, and we can no longer take positions in which we are just a diversity face for the company. And so these are ways that we can incrementally help each other build wealth and begin to make a pathway to financial freedom, because financial freedom unlocks so many doors for us in our communities.
Black Tech Green Money is a production of Blavity AfroTech. It's produced by Morgan DeBond and me, Will Lucas, with additional production support by Love Beach, Stephanie Okbogu, and Raven Earboard. Special thank you to Micah Davis, Sankara Savanyan, like the wine, and yes, that's his real name, and Karika Green. Learn more about Sevetri Wilson and other tech disruptors and innovators at afrotech.com. Go get your money. Peace and love.